What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 200 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about Hellboy, The Troll Witch, and Others. This is Volume 7, if you are keeping up with this series through the trades, as I have been doing. And I've been talking a lot throughout these Hellboy reviews about how sometimes Mignola focuses a whole lot on the mythos that he's been building concerning Hellboy being a harbinger of the apocalypse and the right hand of doom being a big part of that. And you've got these big evils like Rasputin or the Baba Yaga or Hecate, different characters like that who are trying to turn Hellboy into this harbinger of the apocalypse. You've got some stories that focus a lot on that, and then you've got other stories that don't focus on that stuff at all. For example, the previous volume wasn't really mythosy in the first half, but then in the second half it was very mythosy. This one isn't really mythosy at all, and this is also the first time, I think, since Volume 1 that there has been someone other than Mike Mignola working on a Hellboy story. There's one story here that was drawn by P. Craig Russell, who is the guy who did that Ring of Nibelung big, huge 400-something page saga that I talked about a few months ago. He also did an Elric graphic novel a long time ago, and I think a Killraven graphic novel also. But P. Craig Russell, he did the foreword to one of the trades that I talked about a few days ago. He's a big fan of Mignola, and it turns out Mignola is a big fan of his. And then there's also a story here drawn by Richard Corbin. He has done a lot of stuff back in the 1960s. As far as I know, he's still alive. I don't think that he's dead, but he is an older veteran comic book artist. He actually did a story for Marvel. It was a Conan the Barbarian type story. I think it was Star the Slayer or Scar the Slayer, something like that. But his artwork, very, very different from Mignola's. Really, so is P. Craig Russell's, but if I had to pick one of these two guys who has a similar style to Mignola, I would say P. Craig Russell. But this other guy, Richard Corbin, his style is nothing like what we've got going on with Mignola, but I still really like what he's doing. Richard Corbin's art, in a lot of ways, kind of reminds me of Frank Quietly once removed. It's a little bit Quietly-esque, but not quite. You can see some similarities, but you can also tell them apart if you put them side by side. But I kind of had this image in my mind of Mike Mignola being very protective of the Hellboy brand, and that he didn't want anyone else working on it, especially starting with Volume 2, where he was a really talented artist who had been working in the comic industry for about 10 to 13 years by that point. So he was very talented as an artist, but he hadn't done a whole lot of his own scripting, and then he was already doing that starting with Volume 2. But he's not really that protective of his brand. For example, in the BPRD series, he is co-writing it with John Arcudi, I believe. I haven't read any of those books, but I know that he's not the only person working on that series. And so I guess around this point, he was willing to let other people do Hellboy stories other than himself. And I think that's kind of cool. It shows that other people can have interesting things to do in this world while not interfering with his vision of what he has in store for this series. Especially since this series seesaws back and forth between being very heavy on the mythos and not so heavy on the mythos. This can be one of those books that's not so heavy on the mythos, and then you can bring in some other artists and writers to tell their own Hellboy stories. And then he did something very similar to that in a couple of trades called Hellboy Weird Tales, which was exclusively people who are not Mike Mignola working on Hellboy stories. But this is the first time that we get to see that in the main Hellboy line, if you will. So these stories are all pretty good. I like them. I think overall this book is a lot stronger than the one I talked about yesterday, which I felt like wasn't as good as some of the books that had come before. Like I said, this doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the overall arc of Hellboy eventually reigning in the apocalypse. There's one story here that is actually a story about an African folk hero from a long time ago who is supposed to be Hellboy in this story, but his name is not Hellboy. He's drawn like Hellboy, but it's not actually Hellboy doing these things. And that one is kind of sort of foreshadowing some stuff with the Hellboy mythos, but it's also could be seen as just a story that happened to a separate character a long time ago. You don't have to read it as something that will happen to Hellboy at some point in the future. But overall, I like this story. I do think that it's a little bit of a cheat that we are basically stalling the reveal of what is going to happen to Hellboy after he quit the Bureau. I want to see what direction his life goes after he leaves the Bureau. And this is a whole bunch of stories that predate his leaving the Bureau. We have a story set in the 60s, a story set in the late 80s, a story set in the early 90s. We don't get to see what direction is his life going after he went to Africa and then he was kidnapped by mermaids for 2 years. We don't get to see what happens next for Hellboy. I talked about that a little bit yesterday's video. I'd really like to know what is going to go on with Hellboy in his current present-day life. And we have seen some of the other volumes of this series before have gone back and shown some of his missions from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, but I would really like to see what is going on with him right now. I don't necessarily want to see backstories that happened to him in the past at this very moment. I don't mind doing that, but do it later on after you've established his new status quo now that he has left his old status quo. That's a little bit of a problem, but these stories are still very solid. If you jumped in the series with this volume, you wouldn't have any problems picking up what's going on. It's very intuitive, very easy to read. It's not at all difficult to understand what's going on. Do you need the previous 6 volumes to read this one? No. So overall, I do like this. It's much better than Volume 6 in my opinion. So those are my thoughts on Hellboy, the Troll Witch, and others. I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of your day. Catch you later.